In 1965, the world witnessed a moment that seemed almost impossible. A tiny island with no natural resources, no hinterland, and barely any clean water of its own was suddenly thrust into independence. Singapore, a place smaller than many global cities, was expected to fail. Economists predicted collapse. Historians wrote it off as a geopolitical accident. But what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in modern history. This is the story of how a struggling port city became one of the richest nations on Earth. And it begins with a shocking truth. Singapore's rise wasn't luck. It was engineered, designed, built with intention, discipline, and a vision that defied every expectation. But before the skyscrapers, before the financial districts, before the global admiration, Singapore was a place drowning in uncertainty. Its unemployment was soaring. Its GDP per capita was lower than Mexico, Brazil, and even some African nations at the time. Ethnic tensions simmered. The British military, which had been the island's economic backbone, was preparing to withdraw. And the newly independent nation had no army, no industry, and no guarantee of survival. Yet within a single generation, Singapore would become a global financial hub, a logistics powerhouse, and one of the most competitive economies in the world. How did this happen? How did a nation with nothing create everything? The answer lies in a series of bold decisions, dramatic turning points, and economic experiments that would reshape not only Singapore, but the entire global development playbook. The story begins with a leader who refused to accept fate. Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister, understood something crucial. Survival required reinvention. The island could not rely on natural resources, so it would rely on human resources. It could not depend on geography alone, so it would weaponize strategy. And it could not wait for foreign powers to rescue it, so it would build its own destiny. But the path forward was not obvious. Singapore was surrounded by larger, richer neighbors. It had no oil like Malaysia, no land like Indonesia, no population size like India or China. So the government made a radical choice. Instead of competing with its neighbors, it would compete with the world. It would become the safest place for global capital, the most efficient port for global trade, the most disciplined workforce for global industries, and the most predictable environment for global investors. But this vision came with a price. It required strict governance, long-term planning, and a level of social cohesion that many believed impossible in a multi-ethnic society. Yet Singapore pushed forward. It built public housing at a scale the world had never seen. It invested heavily in education, turning illiterate citizens into skilled workers. It created the Economic Development Board, a powerful institution tasked with attracting multinational corporations. And it transformed the port of Singapore into one of the busiest on the planet. But even as the economy began to rise, new challenges emerged. The global oil crisis threatened trade. Regional tensions threatened stability. And critics questioned whether Singapore's model was sustainable. But the island kept adapting. It shifted from labor-intensive industries to high-tech manufacturing, from manufacturing to finance, from finance to innovation. Each transformation was deliberate, calculated, and timed with precision. And with every shift, Singapore climbed higher. By the 1990s, it had become a symbol of economic discipline. By the 2000s, a global hub for wealth. And today, it stands as one of the most competitive economies in the world. But behind the success lies a deeper question. What does Singapore's story teach us about development, leadership, and the future of global economies? And perhaps more importantly, can any nation replicate this miracle? Or was Singapore's rise a once-in-history phenomenon? The answers unfold as we journey deeper into the forces, decisions, and turning points that shaped the Singapore we know today. As Singapore entered the late 1960s, the island stood at a crossroads. The world still doubted its survival, but inside the young nation, a quiet revolution was beginning. The government understood that economic growth required more than ambition. It required infrastructure, stability, and trust. So Singapore began building the foundations of a modern state with a speed and precision that stunned observers. The first step was order. Not the kind enforced by fear, but the kind built through predictability. Investors needed to know that contracts would be honored, corruption would be punished, and the rule of law would be absolute. Singapore delivered exactly that. It created one of the cleanest, most transparent governments in the world, sending a powerful message. This is a place where your money is safe. But order alone wasn't enough. The island needed jobs, industries, and a workforce capable of powering them. So Singapore launched a massive industrialization drive. It invited multinational corporations, companies like Shell, Texas Instruments, and Hewlett-Packard, to set up factories on its shores. These companies brought technology, capital, and global connections. In return, Singapore offered efficiency, stability, and a workforce hungry for opportunity. The strategy worked. Within a decade, unemployment fell sharply, manufacturing output soared, and Singapore transformed from a trading post into an industrial hub. But behind the scenes, another transformation was underway, one that would shape the nation's identity for generations. Public housing. In the 1960s, Singapore faced a housing crisis. Slums dominated the landscape. Fires were common. Sanitation was poor. But instead of treating housing as a social burden, Singapore treated it as an economic engine. The Housing and Development Board built modern apartments at a scale the world had never seen. Entire communities rose from the ground, organized, clean, and connected. Homeownership rates skyrocketed, and with ownership came stability, pride, and a sense of belonging. This wasn't just urban planning, it was nation building. Yet even as Singapore strengthened internally, external threats loomed. The Cold War was reshaping Asia. Regional tensions simmered, and the British military withdrawal in the early 1970s threatened to wipe out nearly 20% of Singapore's economy. It was a moment of crisis, but Singapore turned crisis into opportunity. The government moved quickly to convert former military bases into industrial zones, commercial centers, and ports. It expanded the airport, it modernized the harbor, and it doubled down on its ambition to become a global hub for trade. The port of Singapore soon became one of the busiest in the world, a gateway between East and West. But the island wasn't done reinventing itself. As wages rose and global competition intensified, Singapore realized it could not rely on low-cost labor forever. It needed to climb the value chain. So in the 1980s, the nation shifted again, this time toward high-tech industries. Electronics, precision engineering, petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals became the new pillars of growth. The government invested heavily in education, turning polytechnics and universities into engines of innovation. Scholarships sent students abroad. Research centers attracted global talent. And Singapore positioned itself as a knowledge-driven economy long before the term became fashionable. But with growth came new challenges. Rising inequality, a rapidly changing global economy, and the constant pressure to stay ahead. Singapore responded with its trademark strategy: adapt early, adapt fast. It embraced financial services, transforming itself into a global banking hub. It built Changi Airport, which would become one of the world's best. It created a world-class airline, and it invested in urban planning, ensuring that growth never came at the cost of livability. By the 1990s, Singapore had achieved something extraordinary. It had one of the highest GDP per capita levels in Asia. Its skyline glittered with modern architecture. Its economy was diversified, resilient, and globally connected. But beneath the success lay a deeper truth. Singapore's rise was not a miracle. It was a series of deliberate choices, each one building on the last. Choices that required discipline, sacrifice, and a willingness to think long-term. And yet, the story was far from over. The next chapter would test Singapore in ways it had never been tested before. The Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crash, the rise of China, the shifting tides of globalization. Each event would challenge Singapore's model, forcing it to evolve once again. But as history would show, Singapore had developed a unique ability, the ability to turn uncertainty into opportunity. And that ability would define the next phase of its economic journey. As the 1990s unfolded, Singapore found itself standing at the edge of a new global era, one defined not by factories and ports, but by information, technology, and the rapid acceleration of globalization. The world was changing faster than ever, and Singapore understood that standing still meant falling behind. So once again, the island prepared for reinvention. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 struck like a shockwave across the region. Currencies collapsed, stock markets plunged, entire economies spiraled into chaos. But Singapore, though shaken, remained standing. Its reserves, built through decades of disciplined saving, acted as a shield. Its strong regulatory framework protected its financial institutions, and its commitment to long-term planning allowed it to weather the storm with remarkable resilience. Yet the crisis revealed something deeper. Singapore could no longer rely solely on manufacturing or trade. It needed to become a global hub for knowledge, finance, and innovation. So the nation pivoted again. It strengthened its financial sector, attracting global banks and investment firms. It modernized its legal and regulatory systems to support complex financial products, and it positioned itself as a gateway for capital flowing into Asia. At the same time, Singapore invested heavily in technology. It built research parks, innovation hubs, and digital infrastructure. It encouraged entrepreneurship, supported startups, and opened its doors to global talent. The government understood that the future belonged to nations that could think, innovate, and adapt. And Singapore was determined to be one of them. But the rise of China in the early 2000s introduced a new challenge. China's massive workforce, low costs, and rapid industrialization threatened to overshadow smaller economies. Many nations struggled to compete, but Singapore saw opportunity. Instead of resisting China's rise, it partnered with it. It invested in Chinese cities, collaborated on industrial parks. It positioned itself as a bridge between China and the world. This strategic alignment allowed Singapore to benefit from China's growth while maintaining its own competitive edge. Yet even as Singapore thrived, new pressures emerged. The dot-com crash tested its tech ambitions. The global financial crisis of 2008 shook its financial sector, and rising inequality created social tensions that demanded attention. But each challenge pushed Singapore to evolve. It strengthened its social safety nets. It invested in upskilling and lifelong learning. It diversified its economy into biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, and digital services. And it continued to refine its urban planning, ensuring that growth remained sustainable and inclusive. By the 2010s, Singapore had become a global symbol of efficiency, innovation, and resilience. The skyline reflected its ambitions. Its economy reflected its discipline, and its society reflected its ability to balance diversity with unity. But beneath the success lay a constant truth. Singapore's journey was never guaranteed. Every achievement came from deliberate choices. Every transformation came from strategic foresight, and every crisis became a catalyst for reinvention. Yet the world was entering a new era, one defined by automation, climate change, geopolitical tensions, and shifting global supply chains. The question now was not whether Singapore could rise, but whether it could continue rising in a world where the rules were changing. The island had built prosperity through trade, but global trade was slowing. It had built competitiveness through efficiency, but the future demanded creativity. It had built stability through strong governance, but the next generation sought new forms of expression and opportunity. Singapore stood once again at a crossroads. But history had shown that this small nation possessed an extraordinary ability. The ability to adapt before adaptation became necessary. And as the world watched, Singapore prepared for yet another transformation. One that would define its place in the 21st century and beyond. As Singapore moved into the 2020s, the world around it was shifting faster than at any point in modern history. Global supply chains were being rewritten. Technology was transforming industries overnight. Climate change was reshaping coastlines, economies, and entire ways of life. And geopolitical tensions were rising between major powers, placing small nations like Singapore in the middle of a new era of uncertainty. Yet if history had taught anything, It was that Singapore's strength came not from size, but from strategy. And once again, the island prepared to adapt. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered one of the greatest shocks to the global economy in a century. Borders closed, trade slowed, tourism collapsed. Even Singapore's world-class systems were tested. But the nation responded with the same discipline and coordination that had defined its rise. It deployed reserves to protect jobs. It supported businesses. It accelerated digital transformation. And it strengthened its healthcare infrastructure. The crisis revealed something profound. Singapore's resilience was not accidental. It was engineered through decades of planning, saving, and building institutions capable of responding to the unexpected. But the pandemic was only one part of a larger transformation. The global economy was entering a new phase, one driven by artificial intelligence, automation, green energy, and digital trade. Singapore recognized that its future depended on staying ahead of these shifts. So it invested heavily in research and development. It expanded its digital economy. It built new innovation districts. And it positioned itself as a hub for advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and sustainable technologies. At the same time, Singapore confronted one of its greatest long-term challenges: climate change. As a low-lying island, rising sea levels posed an existential threat. But instead of waiting, Singapore acted. It developed coastal protection plans. It invested in green infrastructure. It redesigned its urban landscape to be more resilient. And it committed to becoming a global leader in sustainability. Yet even as Singapore looked outward, it also looked inward. A new generation was emerging, more global, more connected, and more ambitious than ever. They sought creativity, flexibility, and new forms of opportunity. And Singapore responded by rethinking education, encouraging innovation, and creating pathways for entrepreneurship. The nation understood that its greatest resource had always been its people, and empowering them was the key to its future. But the world was becoming more complex. The rise of new economic powers, the fragmentation of global trade, and the competition for talent created new pressures. Singapore had to balance relationships with major nations, maintain its competitiveness, and preserve its social cohesion, all while navigating a rapidly changing global landscape. Yet through every challenge, one truth remained constant. Singapore's success was built on its ability to adapt before it was forced to anticipate rather than react, to plan not for the next election cycle, but for the next generation. And that mindset continued to guide the nation forward. Today, Singapore stands as one of the most remarkable economic stories of the modern era. A nation that rose from poverty to prosperity, from uncertainty to stability, from a struggling port to a global powerhouse. Its journey is a testament to the power of vision, discipline, and strategic leadership. But it is also a reminder of something deeper, that even the smallest places can shape the world when they dare to think differently. Singapore's story is not just about economics. It is about resilience, reinvention, and the belief that destiny is not given, it is built. And as the world enters a new age of disruption, Singapore continues to evolve, innovate, and prepare for the challenges ahead. Its past is extraordinary, but its future may be even more so, because the true miracle of Singapore is not what it achieved, but how it continues to rise, again and again, in a world that never stops changing. And for nations watching around the world, Singapore offers a powerful lesson. That success is not a moment, but a mindset. Not a miracle, but a model. And not a destination, but a journey. One that continues to unfold with every new challenge and every new opportunity. The story of Singapore is far from over. It is still being written, and the world is still watching.